Hello, my name is Michelle, and I'm 32 years old. I've been married to my husband Sam for almost 8 years, and we have 3 kids together. What started as a simple family affair has turned into an emotional roller coaster, and it all began 5 years ago. I never thought I would be in this situation, dealing with my sister-in-law Riley, trying to take back the child I raised as my own. It's crazy to think that my family could become so divided over something that seems so clear to me. But here we are, and I need to get this all off my chest. 5 years ago, when I was 27, Riley, my 25-year-old sister-in-law, found out she was pregnant. At the time, Riley and her boyfriend weren't serious. He left her as soon as he found out, and Riley was left with the difficult decision of whether or not to keep the baby. She decided to keep the baby, but her commitment to motherhood was shaky from the start. She was only 20 years old and not ready to raise a child, and I don't think she ever really wanted to. I didn't think much about it at the time, though. I didn't know Riley well, and Sam and I weren't particularly close with her. We did what we could to help her, but I never imagined what would happen next. Riley had the baby, and soon after, she asked me for help. She was about to start her second year of college, and she had to drop out when she got pregnant. Her parents, my mother-in-law and father-in-law, couldn't take care of the baby, so Riley turned to me for help. She said it was only for a couple of weeks, just long enough for her to get back to college and for her family to find a place to live near her campus. At that time, I was already a mom, and Sam and I both agreed we would help out. We assumed it was temporary, just a short-term favor, and we would be able to get back to our normal lives soon enough. However, after a few weeks, things took a strange turn. We couldn't get in touch with Riley. We called, sent messages, and even tried reaching out through her family, but she was unreachable, and it became clear that she was avoiding us. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into a month. Riley's family stopped providing us with updates. We felt completely abandoned, and I couldn't help but feel frustrated, confused, and angry. Where was she? What was happening? Was she really going to just leave her baby with us without any warning? 2 months later, my mother-in-law showed up at our doorstep, unannounced, to tell us that Riley had made a decision. She said Riley didn't want the baby anymore and was planning to give her up. According to my mother-in-law, Riley had gone abroad to live a free-spirited life, which was exactly the phrase she used. It was all so vague and surreal that I didn't know how to react. Here I was, holding a baby that wasn't mine, and no one had even asked me if I was okay with this situation. They had dropped a child on me without warning or preparation, and now they wanted to wash their hands of the responsibility. To make matters worse, my mother-in-law said she couldn't take the baby because she was too old and wouldn't be able to care for her. I was angry, but also completely blindsided. Riley had just walked away from her own child, and now it seemed like I was expected to pick up the pieces. This wasn't just a casual babysitting favor. This was something far more serious. I told my husband about the situation, and we were both shocked. How could Riley just disappear and leave her baby behind? As we struggled to process the situation, I realized that Riley had effectively abandoned her daughter. After a lot of thought and several discussions, Sam and I decided we would raise Abby as our own. We knew it wasn't the right thing to just hand her over to my in-laws, especially given that they were already making excuses. This decision wasn't easy, but after everything that had happened, it felt like the only choice we had. Abby deserved a stable life, and that wasn't going to happen if Riley was allowed to come in and out of her life whenever she felt like it. We spoke with a lawyer about our options, and after a long legal process that took more than a year, we were able to officially adopt Abby. Her biological mother's parental rights were terminated due to abandonment, and we became Abby's legal parents. From that moment on, we never looked back. Abby became our daughter, and our family grew stronger. In the meantime, Sam and I went on to have another child, a daughter named Lily, who is now 2 years old. With the arrival of Lily, our family felt complete. We had 3 kids, and I was content. We'd worked hard to create a stable life for our children, and I felt like we were finally in a good place. But just when I thought everything was settled, Riley came back into our lives, turning everything upside down. When I first met Riley, I had no idea about the complicated history she had with her daughter, Abby. I knew about Abby, of course, but the details were always fuzzy. Riley didn't talk much about her daughter when we started dating. She never really opened up about Abby's life or the choices she had made in the past. It wasn't until we were deeper into our relationship that I began to understand the full extent of the situation. Riley had Abby when she was just 20 years old. At that time, Riley's life was still very much about figuring out who she was and what she wanted to do. Abby's father wasn't a part of the picture, and Riley found herself overwhelmed by the idea of becoming a mother. She had big dreams, dreams that didn't involve raising a child. I didn't fully understand the weight of those words until I heard the whole story from Riley herself. Riley told me that when Abby was born, she didn't feel ready to be a mom. She wasn't equipped to handle the responsibility, and she didn't want to give up the life she had planned for herself. Instead of stepping up, Riley made the decision to leave Abby in the care of her sister-in-law, Michelle, under the pretext of needing time to finish her education and figure things out. I had a hard time wrapping my head around it. To me, it seemed like a drastic decision, one that left Abby to grow up without her mother around. But Riley insisted she wasn't prepared to raise a child at that time. She thought Michelle, being a mother herself, could provide the care Abby needed while she worked on her future. What Riley didn't tell me at the time, though, was just how far she had gone to distance herself from Abby. Rather than just taking a break to regroup, Riley left the country and pursued the life she wanted. She spent the next several years traveling, chasing experiences, and essentially abandoning Abby. It wasn't until much later that I understood the depth of Riley's decision. She didn't just leave Abby behind temporarily, she had essentially walked away from being a mother. As the years passed, Michelle and her husband decided to adopt Abby. Legally, Abby became their daughter, and Riley's role in her life was completely erased. Riley didn't have any legal rights, and Abby grew up without her mother. I could see that Riley had regrets about her choices, but she rarely spoke about them, and when she did, it was more about her desire to reconnect with Abby than any real reflection on what she had given up. It was clear that Riley was conflicted. She often expressed regret about not being there for Abby, but there was no real urgency to fix the situation. She never seemed to fully grasp the consequences of her absence in Abby's life. In the years following Abby's adoption, Riley's focus remained on herself, on what she was doing with her life, and the relationships she was cultivating. I was starting to piece together what had happened, but it wasn't until much later that I truly understood how Riley had abandoned her responsibility as a mother. She had pushed Abby out of her life, and while she may have regretted it, she never fully came to terms with the depth of her actions. For Riley, it seemed like Abby's absence was something she could wish away, something she could fix when the time was right. But the reality was different. Riley wasn't just an absent mother. She was a mother who had given up on her daughter completely. When Riley and I became engaged, I could see she was eager to build the life she had always wanted. But there was an undercurrent of guilt when it came to Abby. Riley would occasionally talk about how much she wished she could be the mother she never was, but there was never a concrete plan to make that happen. It was as though she wanted to erase the past and step back into a role she had abandoned without acknowledging what it would take to earn Abby's trust. I didn't know how to feel about all of this. On one hand, I wanted to support Riley in whatever she needed to heal from her past, but on the other hand, I couldn't ignore the reality of what had happened. Riley had walked away from her daughter when she needed her the most, and now, years later, she wanted to come back into Abby's life as though nothing had happened. It was difficult for me to understand. How could Riley expect Abby to just welcome her back after all those years of abandonment? At the time, I wasn't sure where I stood. I wanted to support Riley, but I couldn't ignore how much this would affect Abby. Riley had made her choices, and those choices had led to years of separation from her daughter. I felt for Riley, but I also felt for Abby, who had been raised by Michelle and her husband, who had stepped in when Riley hadn't. Abby had grown up in a stable environment, surrounded by love and care, and now Riley wanted to take all of that away. I wasn't sure if Riley fully understood the depth of the situation, and I wasn't sure how to help her navigate it. Riley's return into Michelle's life and her desire to reclaim Abby seemed to come out of nowhere, and I had no idea how to deal with it. I could see Riley's frustration. She wanted her family to be complete, but I also saw Michelle's point of view. Michelle had taken on the role of Abby's mother for years, and now Riley expected her to step aside as though nothing had changed. It was a delicate situation, and I had no idea how it would unfold, But I knew one thing for sure. The road ahead was going to be messy, and I was stuck right in the middle. Things were calm for years after we adopted Abby. Our family settled into a routine. We had our ups and downs, like any family, but we were happy. I considered Abby my daughter. She called me Mom, and that's who I was to her. There were no questions, no doubts. I loved her with every bit of my heart, and I didn't care that we didn't share blood. Then, about 2 weeks ago, everything changed. I was at home, preparing dinner for the kids, when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I felt a chill run through me when I saw who was standing on the doorstep. It was Riley. I didn't recognize her at first. She was standing there with her new fiancé, Jacob, looking like she hadn't aged a day since she abandoned Abby 5 years ago. But I knew it was her. The nerve of her to show up at our door after everything that happened. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to slam the door in her face right then and there, but I took a deep breath and reminded myself that I had to handle this calmly. Riley didn't waste any time. She told me she was getting married to Jacob and that they were planning on starting a family. She went on to say that she didn't want to go through another pregnancy herself, so she was here to take Abby back, just like that. No apology, no recognition of what she had done, as if Abby was just some possession she could reclaim now that her life was settled. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She wasn't asking, she was demanding. She wanted her daughter back after 5 years of being completely absent. After 5 years of me being her mom. It wasn't even about Abby's best interest for her. Riley seemed to think she could just waltz back in and take her child from the only mother she had known. I asked her to wait for a moment while I went to grab something from inside. My hands were shaking as I went to get the adoption papers, the legal proof that Abby was now my daughter. The documents were sitting in a drawer, just like the memories of how hard we fought to get them. I brought the papers to the door and showed them to her. I could see the shock on her face as she looked at the documents. She didn't say anything for a moment. I waited for her to process the situation, but she didn't seem to be able to handle it. Then the screams started. Riley began yelling from the doorway, accusing me of being unfair, of taking her daughter from her. She said I was being cruel, that I was keeping her from completing her family. I calmly told her that I wasn't going to give Abby back. I made it clear that Abby was mine, legally and emotionally. She had been in our family for 5 years, and there was no way I was going to let Riley take her without so much as a thought for what that would do to Abby. I told Riley that she needed to leave, and when she refused, I threatened to call the police. She kept yelling, and for a moment, I felt like I was losing control. I wasn't used to this. My family had always been a source of comfort, but now it felt like I was fighting them. I didn't want to fight, but Riley left me no choice. She finally left, but not without making sure she got the last word in. It was the same old manipulative tactic she used years ago, blaming me for everything, trying to turn everyone against me. As soon as she left, I shut the door, locked it, and collapsed on the floor. I thought that would be the end of it. After all, I had the legal papers on my side. Riley had no claim to Abby anymore. She had abandoned her, and I had done everything to make sure Abby grew up with love and stability. But the next few days were far from peaceful. I told Sam what happened when he came home, and we both agreed that we weren't going to let Riley's drama affect us. We were parents to 3 beautiful children, and that was what mattered. But then came the calls, the messages from family, and the online post Riley made, where she portrayed herself as the victim. She claimed that I had stolen her daughter and was keeping her away from her biological mother. The post was full of emotion and manipulation. She made it sound like I was the villain in all of this, and people actually started believing her. It was then that I realized things were only going to get more complicated. I couldn't let this lie go unchallenged. I knew I had to stand firm, but the pressure from Sam's family was overwhelming. They were all coming after us, telling us that what we were doing wasn't right, that we had no right to keep a mother and daughter apart, but I couldn't let them see it from Riley's perspective, not after everything she had put us through. I knew deep down that we had done the right thing by adopting Abby. She was ours now, and I wasn't going to let anyone take her from us. I just had to figure out how to keep our family safe from this storm that Riley was stirring up. The day Riley decided to confront Michelle about Abby was one I won't forget. She was insistent, determined, and, frankly, I wasn't sure what to expect. We went to Michelle's house together, Riley's mood a mix of excitement and nervousness. She kept repeating how important it was for Abby to be back with her, like she could just pick up where she left off. I didn't share her confidence. I knew Michelle wouldn't easily hand over Abby. She had been her mother for years, had raised her, loved her, and built a life together with her husband. Riley kept saying that Abby was her biological daughter, that it was her right to raise her now that she was ready to be a mother. But I knew the reality wasn't that simple. Riley might have given birth to Abby, but Michelle had stepped in when Riley left, taking on all the responsibility and love that Abby needed. To Michelle, Abby was her child, and that bond wasn't something Riley could just demand to undo. When we got there, Michelle greeted us with the same calmness she always had, but there was a clear tension in the air. Riley immediately started talking, her words coming out faster and more forceful with each sentence. "I want Abby back," she declared, her voice firm, but I could hear the underlying desperation. "I've got a life now. I'm engaged to Jacob, and I'm ready to be the mother I should have been all along." Michelle didn't respond immediately. She just stared at Riley, processing her words. When she did speak, her voice was steady, but there was a quiet strength behind it. "You know as well as I do that Abby is legally ours now," Michelle said. "We've adopted her. She's our daughter. I'm her mother, and I will always be her mother, no matter what you want." Riley didn't take this well. I could see the frustration bubbling up in her. She tried to argue, but it quickly turned into an emotional outburst. "You think you can just take my daughter away from me? I'm her mother. You've kept her from me for years, and now you expect me to sit back and watch as you keep her forever?" It was the first time I saw Riley like this. I had never seen her so raw, so desperate. It was hard to watch, knowing that this was someone I loved, but at the same time, I could see the selfishness in her reaction. Michelle wasn't the enemy here. She had done everything she could for Abby, and Riley wasn't respecting that. Michelle's calmness remained unshaken. "I'm not taking anything from you, Riley. You left. You weren't there when Abby needed you. We didn't keep her from you. You chose to leave. And now, after all these years, you want to come back and erase everything we've built? It's not fair to Abby." Riley's face flushed with anger, her hands shaking slightly. "But I'm her mother. She's my daughter, and I have a right to be a part of her life, don't I?" "Of course you do," Michelle replied, her voice soft but firm. "But that's not enough. Abby deserves stability. She's had a mother in me for years now, and I'm not just going to step aside because you suddenly want her back. It's not about your right. It's about what's best for her." The tension in the room was palpable. Riley was breathing hard, her eyes wild with frustration. Michelle stood firm, her face calm, but filled with the emotion that came from years of caring for Abby. I stood in the middle, unsure of how to help either of them. I could see both sides, but I also realized how much of this was about Riley trying to rewrite history, trying to reclaim a role she had walked away from. Riley couldn't accept it. "You're not listening," she said, her voice rising. "I want my daughter back. I'm not going to let you keep her from me anymore." At that point, I could see how much this was hurting Michelle. She had been Abby's mother for so long, and now Riley was demanding that she step aside. Michelle wasn't going to let go without a fight, and honestly, I wasn't sure what I expected from this confrontation, but I knew it was only going to get worse. This wasn't just about Riley wanting to be a mother again. It was about the years of absence, the betrayal, and the emotional toll this was taking on both women. Michelle was protective, and rightly so. Riley's demand felt entitled, as if she thought everything could just go back to the way it was. But life didn't work like that, and Michelle wasn't going to let her rewrite the story, not after everything she and her husband had done for Abby. Riley stormed out of the house, and I followed her, unsure of what to say. I was torn between wanting to support Riley, but also feeling for Michelle and Abby. I could feel the weight of what had just happened. This wasn't just a disagreement between two women. This was a moment that would have lasting consequences for all of us. As we left, Riley's anger was still simmering, but there was a part of me that knew she hadn't truly grasped the full impact of her actions. She wanted to be a mother, but she hadn't fully considered what that would mean for everyone involved, especially Abby. This was only the beginning of a much bigger issue, and I wasn't sure how it would all end. It had been over a week since Riley's last stunt at our door, and while I'd hoped it would be the end of it, I quickly realized that she wasn't backing down. The pressure was mounting from every direction. My mind felt like a storm, swirling with doubts and the endless messages from family members who refused to see things for what they were. I couldn't understand how everyone was siding with Riley. They were willing to ignore the truth just because of her dramatic sob story. But I had no choice but to stand firm. Sam and I talked about it every night, trying to calm our nerves. The kids could feel the tension, though. They weren't entirely oblivious, even if we tried to keep them shielded from it. Abby, our beautiful Abby, was starting to ask more questions. She was so young, but I could see the confusion in her eyes when she sensed something wasn't right. I didn't want to expose her to any of this drama, but the weight of it was already seeping into every aspect of our lives. It wasn't just Riley. My mother-in-law had begun calling, sending messages, and even contacting my own parents. She was twisting the situation, calling me cruel, accusing me of keeping a mother from her child. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard when everyone I knew seemed to be questioning my decisions. My own family, the people who were supposed to support me, were starting to doubt me. It felt like I was drowning in guilt and frustration, but I refused to let Riley and her manipulations tear my family apart. Then came the worst part. A few days ago, I was at home with the kids, getting them ready for bed, when Sam came rushing through the door. He had an odd look on his face. Serious, almost worried. He told me that Riley had shown up at the house again, but this time, she wasn't alone. She was with a lawyer. I couldn't believe it. She was actually trying to take legal action now. I was furious. She had abandoned Abby for 5 years, and now she was trying to act like the loving, responsible mother. She couldn't just waltz back into our lives and pretend that time hadn't passed. She had no right to take Abby. But now, with a lawyer involved, things were different. We had no choice but to lawyer up as well. Sam and I immediately called our lawyer. He reassured us that Riley wouldn't be able to take Abby from us. But that didn't stop me from feeling terrified. The last thing I wanted was for Abby to be pulled away from us, to be sent back to a woman who didn't even want her in the first place. It wasn't just the legal battle that scared me. It was the emotional damage that this constant tug of war would do to Abby. She was our daughter, and no matter what anyone said, nothing would change that. The days that followed were filled with anxiety and dread. We had to prepare ourselves for the possibility of a courtroom battle. We met with our lawyers several times to make sure we were ready for whatever came next. And yet, even with all the legal support we had, it didn't ease the pain. It wasn't about the legalities. It was about what was best for Abby, what was best for our family. I didn't want Abby to grow up thinking she was second best, that her birth mother could come back into her life at any moment and take her away. She deserved stability and love, not uncertainty and confusion. Then, just when I thought I couldn't handle it anymore, something happened that completely shocked me. Sam and I had been home for about an hour after a long day when I heard the doorbell ring again. I couldn't bring myself to open it at first. The thought of seeing Riley again made me feel sick to my stomach, but I knew I couldn't avoid her forever. I opened the door, and there she was, standing there with her fiancé Jacob by her side. But this time, she wasn't holding any papers, and no lawyer was in sight. Her eyes were wide, and she looked more vulnerable than I had ever seen her. For a moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy, but I pushed it away. I couldn't afford to feel sorry for her. Not after everything. She asked me if we could talk. I was hesitant, but agreed. I figured she wasn't going to leave until we did, so I might as well get it over with. We went inside, and I sat across from her, feeling the weight of the situation. She started by telling me that she had been wrong, that she regretted abandoning Abby. Her voice trembled as she spoke, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. But as much as I wanted to believe her, I couldn't. It didn't feel genuine. It felt like an act, like she was trying to manipulate me into giving her what she wanted. She went on about how she had changed, how she had found a new sense of purpose with Jacob, and how she was now ready to be Abby's mother. She told me she had spent years working on herself, trying to be a better person, and now she was ready to complete her family. But I couldn't forget the past. I couldn't forget how she had disappeared when Abby needed her most, how she had thrown away her responsibility as a mother. She had abandoned her daughter, and now, just because her life had changed, she thought she could waltz back in and claim her? No, Abby was mine. She was part of my family. I told her that, in no uncertain terms. I said, "You had your chance. You walked away. Now she's mine. And you don't get to take her from me?" Riley looked at me like I had slapped her. There was a long silence, and for a moment I almost regretted what I'd said. But I knew deep down I had made the right choice. Abby was my daughter. She was my responsibility. I wasn't going to let anyone, even family, take her from me. I stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. Riley didn't argue. She just stood there for a moment, as if she didn't know what to do. Then she turned and walked out the door without saying another word. I closed the door behind her, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done playing nice. I would fight for my family, no matter who I had to fight. Things between Riley and Michelle escalated quickly after the confrontation. Riley was stubborn, and in her mind, she wasn't going to back down. She truly believed that Abby should be with her, that she had the right to reclaim the daughter she had left behind. But the reality of the situation hit harder with each passing day. It wasn't just about what Riley wanted, it was about the years of life Abby had already lived with Michelle and her husband. Abby wasn't just Riley's daughter anymore, she was Michelle's child too. Riley kept pushing, and it seemed like the more she pushed, the harder Michelle stood her ground. I could feel the tension growing, and I found myself caught between two people I cared about, both of whom were hurt in their own ways. Riley didn't see it, but Michelle had become Abby's mother in every way that counted. She had been there when Riley had walked away, and she wasn't about to let Riley's sudden return change everything. The breaking point came when Riley showed up at Michelle's house again, demanding to see Abby. This time, Michelle had had enough. She wasn't going to let Riley disrupt their lives any further. Riley had been warned, but she refused to leave. The situation became so heated that Michelle had no choice but to call the police. It was a sobering moment. Riley's actions had forced Michelle into a corner, and she had to take steps to protect her family. I wasn't there when Michelle made the call, but when I arrived shortly after, I could see the devastation in Michelle's eyes. It wasn't just about the confrontation. It was about everything Riley had done to try to tear their family apart. Michelle wasn't just protecting Abby. She was protecting her family, her home, and the life they had built. Riley, however, couldn't see past her own anger and desperation. The situation didn't stop there. Riley's obsession with getting Abby back seemed to escalate. She started to stalk Michelle and her family, showing up uninvited, trying to push her way into Abby's life. It was becoming dangerous. One day it turned physical. Riley slapped Michelle during an argument, and that was the final straw. It was clear to me that Riley was no longer acting out of a desire to reconnect with Abby. She was lashing out, trying to force her will onto a situation that didn't belong to her anymore. Michelle and her husband took immediate action. They filed a restraining order against Riley. It was a painful decision for them, but it was necessary. They couldn't allow Riley to continue violating their boundaries, especially when it became clear that Riley was willing to hurt anyone who stood in her way. The legal action was a statement. Riley had crossed a line, and there was no going back. I didn't know where I stood anymore. I loved Riley, but what she was doing was wrong. I could see how hurt she was, but I also saw how destructive her behavior had become. She had burnt bridges with everyone, including me. I tried to reason with her, but the more I tried, the more I realized that she wasn't listening. It was all about what she wanted, and everyone else was just in her way. Eventually, Michelle and her husband made the difficult decision to cut ties with Riley permanently. They had to protect their family, and that meant no longer tolerating Riley's actions. I couldn't blame them. Watching Riley spiral into manipulation and entitlement had been heartbreaking. She was so wrapped up in her desire to be Abby's mother again that she couldn't see the damage she was causing. In the end, she had lost everything: her relationship with Michelle, her relationship with Abby, and her place in their family. I still loved Riley, but I couldn't support what she was doing anymore. The woman I had fallen in love with was still in there, but she had become someone unrecognizable, a person who was willing to destroy everyone around her to get what she wanted. I was left to pick up the pieces, to process the consequences of Riley's actions, and to face the reality that sometimes people make choices that can't be undone. In the end, I realized that I couldn't change what had happened. Riley had pushed too far, and there was no going back. I still had a lot of love for her, but I couldn't be the person to fix it. I had to let go of the dream I had for us and face the truth that Riley's decisions had cost her everything, and as much as it hurt, I couldn't be a part of the chaos she had created anymore.